Chapter 9. Abby followed Wu and the other soldiers through the hole in the toughened glass screens and down onto the tracks. The glass had shattered into small, safe pieces, but they stepped carefully over the teeming rabbits and mice, all the time checking for traps left by Skinner and his men. They found nothing. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel in front of them, leading off to the east of the city. Abby was keen to run headlong into the looming darkness to get on with the chase, but the others held back. "It's a tunnel," said Wu, adjusting the controls on his gun. "There's nowhere they can run or hide." He aimed the gun forward and let off a rapid burst of fire. Great loops of blue energy scattered away down the tunnel, illuminating the floor and ceiling as they went. The first couple of shots killed the rabbits and mice, the air suddenly tinged with burnt fur and flesh. His next shots carried further, following the contours of the tunnel as it dipped out of sight. Abby and her comrades listened out, and moments later heard the telltale screams as the shots caught up with the English. "Got them," she said. "We'll have to see," said Wu. They ventured forward, dead mice crunching quietly underfoot. The soldiers, Cranford and Teague, started whispering to each other, sharing some joke in poor taste. Abby held a finger up to her lips, and they fell silent. They didn't want to give the English any advantage over them. Inky blackness embraced them. Wu reached into his pocket and produced his wireless phone. He tapped the keypad, and the small screen lit up. It only gave out a paltry amount of light, hardly reaching beyond his hand, but Abby knew he wouldn't risk more. It was risky enough in itself. "What the hell's that?" The soldier's astonishment pierced the silence. Wu raised his phone up, making his way to the side of the tunnel, examining the stalactites. A pair of legs protruded from the wall, fused into the brickwork. They were singed where Wu's earlier gunfire had passed over them, but they must have been long dead already. As Wu got closer, the legs moved slightly, swinging at the knees. It was an eerie sight. For a moment, Abby thought it must be some kind of sculpture, art perhaps, or an advertisement. But the first train to pass down the tunnel would just shear the legs off from the wall. "It's one of their test pilots," said Wu. "He must have landed inside the tunnel wall. Not much we can do for him now." He turned away, the dangling limbs lost to the darkness again. Abby was glad to lose sight of them, but as they kept on down the tunnel, phantom shapes played in her mind, legs swinging in blackness. Bamford almost surrendered to him, very nearly just gave up the gun. The shock of the others brought her back to her senses. Their gasps, their words of disbelief. She still had something over them. "How did you know?" she said. "What gave it away?" "Nothing in particular, I assure you," said the doctor. "You've kept your secret very well. But you knew the police box was involved, and you recognized the portal when you first saw it. Once I had observed that, it was simply a matter of asking the right questions and listening attentively. You knew Andrews once, of course." "Yes," she said. "I wondered why you took so against him. But the man here is not the man you knew." "I was the test pilot, years ago, for me," she said, pitifully grateful to be able to tell them. "I was the colonel, and an Andrews worked for me. He was nothing like this parody of a man." "I don't deserve to die just because of that," said Andrews, a boyish smile taking over his features. She recognized that look from the man she had known. "You're not him," she said levelly. "That's why you were so keen on getting rid of his fellows, of course," the doctor continued. "They simply served to remind you of how far you are from home." While everyone else in the room was horrified, the old man appeared not to judge her. It was as if he found the whole concept fascinating. This was a novel twist on his experiment, and he really wanted to explore the ramifications. "The 2004 I knew was quite different," she said. trying to hide the hope welling inside her. "Can the hoop get me back there?" "No," said the doctor. "It's a one-way ticket. That can't be a surprise to you." "No," said Bamford. People round the room sighed, as if she'd just given in. She set her jaw. "If I shoot this one, then the experiment never happened. He never walked through it, so these other versions of him will just disappear." Her fingers were sweaty around the handle of the gun. She was usually such a sure shot. "It won't make any difference," said the doctor calmly. This was all just a riddle to him, and, she realized, one he'd already worked out. "You will merely cement the paradox." She actually laughed. "You don't get it, do you? I created all this. I sent the police box back to the beginning. It was me." "I don't understand," said the doctor. He looked like he might at last be afraid of her. "She sent the TARDIS back in time to herself in the past," Susan cried, from over by the test room. "Don't you see, Grandfather? It's what started all this. It's what the experiments are based on." "I saw it," said Bamford, "in the haze as I passed through time. Saw a police box." "We saw it too, you know," said one of the Andrews duplicates. "An odd sort of vision, I thought. Makes a bit of sense now, though." "You're nothing to this," she told him. "I found the police box years ago, and I've locked it away, Doctor, where you'll never find it." Another Andrews stepped forward. There was now a small group gathered around the original. "We've all of us been through the hoop," one of them said. "It's all for one now, like the damn musketeers. Sorry, but you're one of us too, General." "And you've only one bullet left," said Griffiths, "by my count." "No," said Bamford, desperate not to let them draw her into their cosy world. They weren't afraid of her. She needed them to be afraid of her to keep everything together. The aberrations, for that was what they were, could not be allowed. "I can offer you a new life," said Griffiths. "An armistice. Don't do this." "At least," chipped in the doctor, "tell me what day you arrived on. What was the date?" The question threw her. He alone in the room did not hope to overcome her. She realized what he would do with the information, or at least try to do. Bamford had no better options open to her. Let him take it on. "The 17th of October, 1972, she said. "And where? Where did you arrive?" "On the dockside, at West India Quay, where the station is now." "Thank you, General." "No, thank you, Doctor." She sighed, held the gun steady, pointing right into the first Andrew's face, and pulled firmly back on the trigger. A shot echoed across the lab, and the women behind her screamed. A flush went through Bamford, exhilaration at what she'd just done. The Andrewses stared wide-eyed at her, their astonishment making her giddy. Griffith stepped forward into her line of sight and snatched the pistol from her hand. He already had his own pistol. It was smoking. Just like him, she thought, to have an old-fashioned bullet shooter when all his friends had laser guns. He was always so backward. He dodged out of her way as she fell forward into warm shadows. Bamford felt, from a distance, the floor smack into her. She felt nothing but relief that her war was finally over. They saw the soldiers waiting for them, silhouettes darting about in the light at North Greenwich Station. Wu felt sure Skinner had only a handful of men, and most of those they had found in the tunnel, sprawled out wherever they had been caught by the energy blasts. They had not found Skinner's body, though, and assumed he had left his men behind him to delay his pursuers. "He's got reinforcements," said Abby. "The dome will be full of soldiers." "We'll deal with them," Wu said. "We've got the strength of arms." "But you can't call for help from down here. Your phone won't work." "Not a problem." So saying, he fired one pulse out in front of them. The swirl of blue light swept down the tunnel, and the soldiers at the station ahead of them cried out as they died. A rifle crackled in reply, but the antiquated English guns just didn't have the range to reach Wu and the others. They fired twice more before the English fell silent. They made their way warily into the light of the station. A dozen English soldiers lay dead on the tracks, their bodies letting off a pungent, burnt whiff. After all his years in the army, Wu almost found that stink welcome. It meant hard-won victories. He didn't like the disadvantage he and his troops were at now, down in the gully for the track, the platform at chest height to them. They kept low, out of sight, wary for wires and other crude traps. Above their heads, the toughened glass screens were all open, as if awaiting a train. Presumably, the English had wanted maximum access to the track to ease their defensive positions. Skinner had not told his men exactly what they would be facing. They were not prepared for South African energy weapons. A bullet whistled some feet above his head and smacked into the curved concrete wall of the station. A stupid move on the part of whoever fired it, achieving nothing but to give away their position. Abby raised her gun so that it peeped up over the platform. She fired a number of blasts, drowning out the sound of screaming as more soldiers died. Again there was quiet. Abby raised her head. Wu waved his other two men back, waiting for Abby's report. She nodded, reached her hands up and leapt, cat-like, onto the platform. Wu watched her, crouched and cautious as she ventured forward. A good soldier. She ran forward, out of sight. Tense moments followed. They could hear nothing. Wu could never stand the waiting. A sound, footsteps, and the men raised their weapons. Abby appeared on the platform above their heads. "All clear," she said. "There's a tunnel takes us right up into the dome, but there's no one up there." "Good," said Wu. "Let's get going." Wu, Cranford and Teague clambered onto the platform. 3 dead English soldiers lay sprawled on their backs, around a half-assembled gun on a tripod. There was one exit to their left. They made their way up the corridor in spearhead formation, the best way to cover whoever was in the lead, and therefore most exposed. They saw nobody, heard nothing. Wu expected an ambush at any moment. The corridor led them into an open area with 2 escalators leading upwards. Far up at the top, daylight peeked in through a doorway. A pale shape, blotting out much of the sky. Had to be the dome. "I don't like this," he said. "It's too open." They couldn't get up the stairs without compromising themselves. English soldiers at the top would have no problem picking them off at their leisure. Wu held back, considering. "We'll go in pairs," he said. "Cranford and Teague, you're up first." The soldiers nodded, knowing he didn't like this any better than they did. They hunched over, guns at the ready, and ran forward to the stairs. They took the same escalator, keeping close together as they bounded up the steps, presenting the smallest front to any enemy marksman. No one shot at them. As Cranford and Teague got halfway up, he could see their disbelief just in the way they ran. He knew they'd be grinning like idiots, and wanted to shout at them, to tell them to knock it off. They weren't out of this yet. Abby, beside him, was eager to move. "Hold on," he said. "Griffiths would never forgive me if I—" She batted him in the arm. "Griff doesn't come into it," she said. He shrugged. "Yeah, well, in that case I was thinking—" Abby threw herself at him, knocking him onto his back. She was heavy in all her kit, surprisingly so. She let out a great sigh while, above them, bullets spattered against the walls of the corridor, shooting from back on the platform. One of the Englishmen had only been pretending to be dead. Abby should have checked that. Wu shot back, not able to see what he was doing with Abby still strewn on top of him. His second shot took out the gunner, and again there was silence. Cranford and Teague were bounding down the escalator to offer assistance. They were too late. "Damn it," said Wu, as they lifted Abby from him. The bullets had flecked her back and head. He closed her staring eyes. "Probably never felt it," said Cranford, putting a hand on Wu's shoulder. "And saved your life as well," said Teague. They were right to be so blunt. There was still work to be done. Yeah, said Wu, getting to his feet. But I'm the one who'll have to tell Griffiths. They left the body and charged up the escalator, 2 steps at a time. Barbara watched the soldiers gather up Bamford's body, fascinated by the men's attention. Griffiths had told them that the general would be accorded a decent burial. Barbara liked that. For all Bamford had done, for all she had done to the people in this room, they would prove themselves better than her. When they carried the wrapped body away, Barbara returned to her friends. Ian had something in his hand. The moment he saw her approach, however, he closed his fingers over the thing, stuffing it into his trouser pocket. Barbara had never known Ian to be secretive, but the look he gave her was one she remembered. Once, after a parents' evening had dragged on till late, Ian had asked if she fancied a drink. He had said it so casually she had barely paid heed, turning him down, she told him, because she had her mother to get home to. Then she had seen his face, trying to smile, trying to mask the embarrassment that engulfed him, trying to spare her. She had spent weeks afterward agonizing over it. He had that same look about him now. She realized what she had seen him hiding from her. A ring. The doctor and Susan had examined the equipment in the laboratory, but had found nothing that could help them get the ship back. "I can only apologize again," said Kelly, as if it was somehow his fault. "We really have lost it then?" Barbara asked, eager to think about anything other than Ian. The doctor just glared at her. "I don't think so," said Susan. "If it's gone back in time, then it will already be here. It will have been waiting for us." "Bamford said she'd locked it up, so we just need to find it," said Ian. "We saw a police box, though, didn't we, when we first arrived by the traffic light tree?" "You did?" asked the doctor. "I don't think that was the TARDIS, though," said Susan, furrowing her brow. "I don't think it can have been. It was different, a real police box." "No," nodded Ian, looking up at Barbara. "That would be too easy." She almost joined in the joke with him. She wanted to, but still she held back. Barbara couldn't help feeling suspicious of him. "But if the TARDIS was sent back in time," she said, "it would have to be somewhere here now. It's cause and effect, isn't it?" "You think of history as a straight line, yes?" The doctor seemed impressed with her. That usually meant he would knock her theory down. "Yes." "Well, let's see," he said, taking a pen and making his way up to the blank wall of the laboratory. She was rather amused by the thought that he would write across the bare plaster show such a reckless disregard for normal behaviour. With his thumb, he flicked the cap from the pen. He paused, pondering, then in one swift movement he drew a great sweep of a line up the wall, as far as he could reach. Vertically, not horizontally. Barbara wanted desperately to argue, to tell him that he had got it wrong. He drew a notch in the line, right near the top. "This is where we are," he said. He drew a notch towards the bottom of the vertical line. "This is where Bamford first arrived, back in 1972. "But she's not from this time, is she, Doctor?" said Ian. "No? Then where is she from?" "Well," Ian turned to Barbara for assistance. "She's from another now, another 2006. The doctor waggled the back of the pen at her. "Very good," he beamed. "That's exactly where she came from." He turned back to the line on the wall. About halfway between his 2 notches, he added another line, cutting off from the main trunk and reaching diagonally up. He had now drawn what looked like a capital letter Y. He made a notch near the top of this new branch. "That is where the General left from, test pilot for someone else's time experiments." "She would have been a young woman then." "It's incredible," said Kelly. "So her past and our past is the same place?" asked Griffiths. The doctor tapped the lower notch with the pen. "Just so, Mr. Griffiths, just so." "But why did she go so far back in time?" asked Kelly. "Our experiment was only for an hour." They all exchanged looks. Barbara saw the doctor and Susan grin at each other. She understood what that meant. "It's the TARDIS, isn't it?" she said. The doctor regarded her coolly. He had no sharp answer to that, which meant she had to be right. "Yes," he said at length. "But you told the General the police box had nothing to do with it," protested Kelly. "Well, I lied," said the doctor shamelessly. He stuck his chin out. "Your mechanism looks for an anchor, doesn't it? That's what you call it, an anchor. Well, the ship will be a bigger magnet, a bigger lodestone." He turned back to the wall again. "There is a TARDIS here." He drew a circle around the notch at the bottom of the tree. He looked back at them all to see if they'd cottoned on. Shaking his head when they obviously hadn't, he drew a circle around the first notch he had made, the one marking where they all were now. "There was also a TARDIS here, until just a few moments ago." He redrew the line between the two circles, thickening that branch again and again. "So people who step through the hoop don't just go back an hour," said one of the Andrewses. "They end up somewhere between those 2 points." "Precisely so, my boy," said the doctor. "I dare say there's some advantage to starting from a nearer branch. That's why all of you have ended up here when you did." He continued to add branches to the main line, making it look more and more like a tree. "But Bamford was from a further away branch," said Ian, "so she was pushed back further in time. She went back 30-odd years." "It's absurd," said Kelly. "It's not possible. I mean, think of what you're saying. How many test pilots would that mean have been turning up here for decades?" The doctor lowered his eyes as if mourning. "The Isle of Dogs has always had a problem with vagrants. Isn't that what you said? They're what your butcher's shop on Bing Street was built to deal with." The scientists at the dome followed Skinner without argument. From their side of the Thames, they had watched the South African army raining down on the other bank, and they assumed they'd soon be visited by one army or another. Skinner hated the way they toadied around him, knowing they'd have acted no differently had the enemy got to them first. These people had no scruples, no loyalty. England didn't deserve a victory, if this was the best they could do. He brandished the paper Bamford had given him. "These are my orders," he said. "You will comply in full." "Yes, sir," exclaimed one of the scientists. Skinner had not asked their names. It was better that way. "The orders refer to classified documents. You have those to hand?" "We'll need to open the safe." "Do that. I've no time to spare. There are enemy soldiers close behind me." "Yes, sir." The scientist nodded at two of his fellows, and they hurried to fetch the papers. "Good," said Skinner. "You have defensive procedures here?" "We can lock a series of doors on them." The scientist bit his lip. "The soldiers were all called out to Canary Wharf, I'm afraid. We've only had basic weapons training." Skinner nodded. "It's imperative you keep them out until my work's completed." The scientist swallowed. "We'll do everything we can, sir." They wouldn't last long, Skinner knew. Glancing back, he had seen the 3 South African soldiers emerge from the tube station, which meant they'd cut a path through his men. A handful of eggheads with a few weekends' firearm practice would barely inconvenience them. Still, it might stall them long enough for Skinner to finish his mission, and it would keep the scientists from under his feet. It would also mean they couldn't protest at what he was about to do. Barbara sat with the doctor in the mess room, out of the way of all the activity taking place in the lab. She had made them both tea. With the door to the mess open, they could eavesdrop on the work being done. The doctor had his eyes closed as he listened in on Susan. The girl had offered to help Kelly and the Andrewses with their experiments, and was now looking over the instruments that controlled the time portal. Barbara heard her laughing every so often, no doubt at the scientist's best efforts to understand. Barbara was more interested in Ian. He and Griffiths discussed plans for the new regime, Griffiths with a phone in each hand, keeping track of the South African units scattered about London. Barbara could glean only fragments of what was going on. A man, Roberts, had turned up in Walthamstow, leading a militia of English turncoats. Griffiths and he were apparently old friends. The City of London had no one left in office to formally surrender to the South Africans. Frantic negotiations were going on to elect someone with some kind of authority to cede. "You find him unsettling," said the doctor quietly, not opening his eyes. "Ian?" she said. "Yes, I do." She thought for a moment. The doctor did not move, did not attempt to encourage her. That was what made it easy to talk to him, to unburden herself. "He's the real Ian, I know that now," she said. "He's just the same as he always was. He always does the right thing, and he always tries to protect us, to protect me. I just I felt..." She put her hand up to her mouth. "I saw him earlier. When they took Bamford away, he had a wedding ring. He hid it from me." The doctor brooded, keeping silent. "You knew, didn't you?" Barbara continued. "The other Ian, the man who died, it was his ring. It's me, isn't it? On the branch he came from. We would have been married." Still, the doctor said nothing, but she knew that if she'd got it wrong, he would have said so. "That means there's another me, different but me all the same. And she's a widow. We've lost him." "Ian is here and alive," said the doctor, reaching for her hand. "But the branch he was from..." Tears pricked at her eyes. She refused to let them come. "He changed things when he came here. Where we are now is all that matters." "So that branch is cancelled out? It just stops being there?" The doctor held her gaze. He didn't lecture her. He didn't patronize her. Very simply and quietly, he said, "I don't know." Barbara stared back at him. What could she possibly say to that? "We cannot reach them anyway," the doctor went on. "All we can work with is what's here and now." "That's why you don't change history," she said. "It's not that you can't, you just won't. It breaks everything up." "And it's easy to get carried away," he said carefully. She felt like he understood, like he'd wanted all along to spare her this pain and confusion. "We can't afford to be ostentatious in our travels." "But why, Doctor? Who can ever know what you've done, what you've changed?" He smiled sadly. "There are those who can," he said, "and they will find us more easily if we draw attention to ourselves." Barbara considered this. "The experiment here," she said. "It's bad news for us, isn't it? I mean, for you and me, Ian and Susan." The doctor said nothing. "How bad is it going to be, Doctor?" His eyes twinkled mischievously at her. "I haven't any idea at all," he said. In an instant, his mood had changed again. "But it will be noticed. It will catch up with us, sooner or later. At least, it'll catch up with me. I shall have to find a home for Susan, somewhere safe for her." Barbara recoiled from him. "You're going to abandon her?" She couldn't believe it. The doctor rested his chin on his hands. "If I ever get you and Ian back to your own time, perhaps you would take her with you. Yes, I can see she'd be happy with you." Barbara took his hands. "Of course, we'd do anything you asked us," she told him. "But you must understand. Susan won't ever leave you. Not voluntarily." "No," said the doctor, shaking his head. He looked broken. "I don't believe she would." A man in a lab coat leapt from the gangway, dodging the blue energy rings Teague had sent his way. The scientist hadn't thought about what he was doing. He acted instinctively. The gangway was 20 stories up inside the dome complex, and the scientist, arms and legs windmilling, screamed all the way down. He was cut short by the concrete on the ground. These weren't soldiers they were fighting, Wu could tell, yet what they lacked in training and experience they made up for in zeal. They were worse to fight than soldiers. Soldiers you could predict. Wu, Cranford and Teague had made slow but consistent progress into the power station. Concentrated fire from their energy weapons could get through each sequence of doors. Each door they obliterated had one or two gunmen stationed behind it, who took a few minutes to overcome. Then it was into the next door, and the next. The gangway spiraled up around the main mass of the power generator on their left, leading up, they assumed, to a control room at the top. They were only a third of the way to their goal, Wu estimated. Even so, he didn't like firing weapons inside a nuclear power station. They concentrated their fire to the right, away from the complex of machinery and systems, some bigger than Wu's house. He reached for his phone. The dialing tone crackled in his ear. No doubt the power station interfered with reception. Griffiths answered after just the one ring. Wu gave him a quick appraisal of the situation. "We've got to assume Skinner means the worst," he said. "He intends to blow us all up." "Agreed," said Griffiths. "Reinforcements are close behind you." "Not going to make much difference, Griff. I thought you could use your magic hoop, have us in here before Skinner arrived." The line crackled. Griffiths was either considering or consulting his team. "Assume we can't," he said at last. "We'll try it, though." "Understood. Got to go anyway. Out." Teague and Cranford had almost demolished another door. Wu slipped his phone back into his pocket and raised his gun again. He was glad he had not been asked about Abby. The hoop glared with energy, blinding them all with white light. 3 soldiers stepped forward, guns ready. They looked terrified, thought Ian. They were caught between the imminent nuclear holocaust Griffiths told them was coming and the tantalizing horror of the portal. Would they share Andrews's fate, Ian wondered, and each be split into half a dozen men? It would only help them take the dome that much quicker if they did. The doctor had been seconded to the controls. He and Susan had argued about coordinates, and not even the other scientists had understood. "In layman's terms, please, Doctor," Kelly begged. "Tell us what this thing is going to do." The doctor didn't answer, being too busy with complex mathematics in his head. Susan rolled her eyes. "We don't have an anchor," she said. "We're just throwing the men into time if we let them go through it now. They might end up anywhere." The thought had obviously not occurred to Kelly. The soldiers regarded him nervously. "So we're going to do something else," said Susan. "The hoop reaches into time, and we think we can adjust the focal length." "Like a lens," and Andrews laughed. "When I was a youngster, the first experiment I ever did was using a magnifying glass in the sun to start a fire." "Me too," said Ian. "It's a bit more complicated than that, though, surely." "Yes, it is," barked the doctor. He waved them all away from him. "This is very difficult indeed, and I will need some space to think it out." The doctor's hands moved quickly over the controls, that same fluency he had with the TARDIS. He and Susan hardly exchanged a word as they worked. Kelly, Griffiths, and the Andrewses were entirely at a loss to explain what was happening. "Right, Susan," said the doctor. "Switch it over." Susan slowly worked a dial. The test room flushed with searing pink light, and the machines around the laboratory clanked and gnashed in protest. "You'll destroy it!" Kelly yelled over the cacophony. "It's eating up power," said the doctor, reading from one of the gauges. "But I think you can step through." The soldiers all looked to Griffiths. When he nodded, each man stepped into the incredible brightness of the hoop and was gone. As soon as the last man had stepped through, Susan turned back the dial. Slowly, the machines quietened, and the brilliant light of the time portal was dimmed. Griffiths was soon on the phone. "Wu," he said. "Any change there?" His brow furrowed as he listened to what Wu had to say. "Fine," he said. "Understood. Tell Abby I'm sorry." He snapped the phone shut. "No good," he said. "No change." "Confound it," said the doctor. "It ought to have worked." "We're all going to die if they do anything to the dome," Kelly said, terror overcoming him. "Why didn't it work, Doctor?" asked Ian. The doctor shrugged. "Those men have gone over to another branch," he said. "They may have been able to do something, but not here." "Or they were drawn off course by the TARDIS," Barbara added. "Yes," said the doctor. "But, whatever the case, we're not going to stop the bomb from dropping now, are we?" The control room of the dome was a small cabin, surrounded by consoles of one kind or another. The lights directly in front of him flashed urgently. Outside, behind the locked door, Skinner could hear the siege going on. The South Africans were almost on top of him, but he, too, had almost completed his work. The secret file they had unearthed for him had been sealed with wax. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a 3-page briefing on the dome. Skinner had been halfway through the introductory paragraph on fast breeder reactors and the military potential of the additional plutonium they created before he realized he could skip it. The second document was a single page, all in succinct bullet points. It was simply a matter of working his way through the instructions. The majority of his work was disabling the fail-safes. "Switch liquid sodium coolant to off," said one. Skinner searched through the various controls, found the switch marked liquid sodium coolant, and pressed it. Somewhere down below him in the reactor, machinery responded. Warning lights flashed. "Ignore warning lights," his instructions continued. "Wait for coolant lights to turn off. Approx 3 minutes. Skinner found the coolant lights, a row of 10 bulbs, all alight. As he waited, listening to the South Africans plough onwards towards him, the light furthest on the right flickered out. He licked his dry lips, willing the system to hurry up. If the enemy stopped him, it would only be by a whisker. After maybe 2 or 3 seconds, the second of the lights went out. There was a crash against the metal door, so loud he flinched. He watched the row of lights. Another bulb went dark. A moment later, the door was hit again, leaving a dent. The invaders were using a fire axe to get into him. They would not risk their energy weapons on the control room, he realized. The 4th bulb went out. Come on, he thought. Another strike to the door gashed a long sliver out of it. The axeman wriggled the end of the axe into the gap, but could make no progress that way. He returned to bashing the door again. When Skinner looked back round at the coolant lights, bulbs 5 and 6 had gone out, then 7. Just 3 left. He licked his lips. The axeman broke more splinters from the door. Skinner could hear him swearing under his breath. He could almost feel sorry for the man. Another light went out, 2 bulbs to go. There was enough of the gash in the door now for Skinner to just see the men on the far side. He glared at the coolant lights. 1 flickered and died. 1 left. He hurried to the controls marked Control Rod Operation. He held his breath. The final light winked off. As instructed, Skinner clicked off all the safety clamps. His hands were clumsy, too eager to get the job done. "Give yourself up, Mr. Skinner," called a man from the far side of the locked door. His accent couldn't hide evident terror. "We won't harm you if you surrender to us now." He ignored them. The penultimate bullet point told him to withdraw the control rods. He could see nothing that said release on it anywhere on the board. In a sudden panic, he looked all round. He almost fell over the wrought iron lever housed in the floor of the cabin. A brake protruded from the top. He squeezed the brake, feeling the lever free itself to him. The South Africans kept at the door, prizing out a splinter 1/2 an inch wide. They tried to wiggle a pistol into the gap. They were too late. They would never get their victory. England for the English, or not at all. Skinner read the final instruction. Don't bother trying to outrun it, and pulled sharply back on the lever. There was a bang and heat, and for a moment he thought the explosion had been instantaneous. Staggering forward, he realized he had been shot. The gun fired again, but he had moved, and the bullet pinged into the controls. It made no difference. As the briefing notes had spelled out to him, inside the reactor, neutrons were now being flung about unchecked, the rate of reaction spiralling upwards towards critical. They were all of them dead now. "Professor Kelly," the doctor called out, "we need that link." He had got them all working frantically, tearing out 2 of the larger control boxes in the lab, connecting cabling up all around them. Ian stood out of the way, with Barbara watching it all, feeling useless. Susan and the Andrewses were dashing about, checking connections and readouts. The men took their orders from the girl. They clearly didn't understand what she was asking of them. None of them did, but they worked quickly and efficiently. Perhaps they were just keeping the scientists busy, so they wouldn't think about what was about to hit them. Griffiths' phone rang. He answered it in that first ring and listened to no more than 2 words. "Damn it," he said, dropping the phone and getting on with his work. "Doctor, meltdown is coming." Ian put his arm around Barbara's waist. She took his other hand in hers. "Finished!" Susan squealed, jumping back from the circuitry. "Switching on," the doctor said, and twirled the dial all the way round. Nothing happened at first. Ian felt a tremor go through him, as if from a distance. Was that fear, or the dome exploding? No, he realized. The machines all around them were humming into life. The hoop in the test room suddenly burst with colour and light. Gloopy patterns of red and pink played across the laboratory, twisting and weaving. Ian stared blindly into the heart of the swirling, rippling mass. The light reached out around the scientists, around the doctor and Susan. It flattened them, like people seen through binoculars, he thought. No, that wasn't right. The dimensions were different, but not flat. He just couldn't take it in. All eyes were on the hoop. Before, it had been enthralling. Ian had felt himself drawn towards the white light. Now its power was undeniably stronger, but Ian wanted to stay where he was. He couldn't see the hoop itself, just an epicentre of light. He stared transfixed into that black hole for what might have been forever. The spell was broken by the doctor, turning from the portal and dusting down his hands. "I think that seems to have worked," he said. It took a moment for anyone else to respond. "What did you do?" Barbara asked. She had recovered her wits faster than Ian. "Oh, it was simple, really," the doctor said. "We needed more power last time to stretch what did you call it, Susan? The focal length. By stretching the focal length even farther, we've had to take in that much more power." "You used the explosion." "Harnessed it, yes. Well, some of it anyway. It's impossible to know how much, of course, not knowing the size of the bang in the first place." "You've saved us all!" That came from Griffiths. "Well, only maybe," said the doctor. "As I say, there might still be fallout. I might only have siphoned off the merest percentage of the power. The rest of it will be irradiating the world outside." "But the portal's still open," said Kelly, mesmerized by the swirling vision in the test room. "And it might continue to be for many hours," said the doctor. "That doesn't mean to say that it's burning off the power from the dome like some kind of gaslight. You think too much in simple linear terms, Professor." "So, where does the portal lead now, Doctor?" asked Griffiths. "How far did you push it?" "October 1972, said the doctor. "At least if I've got my sums right." "Why then?" asked Griffiths. Then he realised. "That's the same date as Bamford said she arrived." "Yes," said the doctor. "This should come out a little before the 17th, though. That's maybe a day or 2 ahead of her." "If one of us went back, we could stop her. We could stop the experiment. We could change everything before it happened." "Yes," said the doctor. "We could." "I'll do it," said Griffiths, running towards the test room. The doctor stepped into his path. They glared at each other, Griffiths towering at least a foot over the old man. "You can't stop me, Doctor," he said levelly. "Griffiths, you've a daughter here," cried Barbara. Griffiths did not look back. "You knew," Barbara said, pulling free of Ian. "It's what you've always planned, to change things. You knew you were never going home. That's why you were so cold to Abby." "I can make things better for all of us," said Griffiths. "It's what has to be done." The doctor gripped the lapels of his waistcoat. "Not on your own," he said. "What? You want to come too?" "Grandfather, we can't," cried Susan, running to him. "We can't change history." "We already have changed it," the doctor replied. All this work have been based on my ship." "We don't know that. How can they have got inside? You locked the doors, remember?" Yes, but they've had 3 decades to find a solution to that.
And they must have found some way, because without it they wouldn't have a time machine now. It stands to reason. And even if Bamford understood that, she's the cause of all this. If we recover the ship before she or the scientists can get to it, the time experiments will never have happened. We can unmake all this mess.
1972, said Kelly, staring blankly into space. We were working in the offices in Whitehall. I can give you the address. He rummaged in his pockets for pencil and paper.
Thank you, said the doctor.
He stepped forward. You realise what this will mean, though, to all your years of work? Kelly glanced about the lab. The portal was meant to end the war, he said quietly.
It can do better than that.
It can make it never happen.
But we could look for the ship here, Susan insisted. We don't need to go back. Susan, the ship has been missing for a very long time. The General could have hidden it anywhere. Yet Professor Kelly can give us the exact address of the place if we only go backwards in time.
Kelly handed over the paper he had written on. I was quite a junior then, he said. I never got to see the alien materials myself, but that's where it all was. You'll need a pass, though, to get in to see it, and I'm sure I can talk my way in, said the doctor. I do have experience they'll be interested in. Then it's agreed, said Griffiths, pocketing his phone.
We mustn't change history, Susan pouted.
Ian had been so awed by her work on the portal, he'd almost forgotten she was just in her teens.
But Susan, said the doctor in his softest voice, we change history every time we step out of the doors of the ship.
You said that, began Barbara. The doctor whirled on her.
Do you really want to know, Miss Wright? He said. Do you really want to know? The TARDIS is built specifically not to change history. We can visit, we can observe, and the ship can disguise itself so no one ever need know we were there. But only so long as we never step outside. We watch it all on the scanner. My people, you see...
He paused, searching for the words.
Doctor?
Barbara prompted.
I couldn't do that, could you? He said. It's not travel. It wouldn't be real. We've seen the most incredible things, but without stepping out of those doors, I might as well have stayed in your time, content with your television sets.
Ian took Barbara's hand, stopping her from responding. He knew what she wanted to say, that the doctor had lied to them that time in Mexico. He had lied to them about what they could do, about what their responsibilities were. He had made them feel like children when they had been right all along. Still, recriminations could wait. We can't hang around, said Ian. We don't know how long the portal will remain open. Very true, said the doctor. There's no time like the present. They had no belongings to gather up. The doctor simply led them into the test room. Kelly and the Andrewses held back. You should come with us, said Ian. We don't know how much fallout there'll still be. What will become of us if you succeed? Asked Kelly. Will our branch of time simply cease to be? They all turned to the doctor. I don't know, he said. I'm sorry, I really don't. My family are in Woolwich, said Kelly. I couldn't leave them, not like that. He looked crestfallen. I'm sorry, Professor, said the doctor. You've done excellent work. You should be proud. Kelly smiled gratefully. And you? Ian asked of the Andrewses. Once was enough, said one of them, and who's to say it won't duplicate you like it did with us? The doctor huffed. I could explain to you exactly why not, if we only had the time, he said. But let me assure you, there aren't going to be any other doctors floating about the place. You should come with us. It's no joyride, said another of the Andrewses. We'll make the most of what's going on here, said a third. The Andrews with Andrews 1 on the label round his wrist could only shrug. I'll stick with these chaps. They did not come forward. There were no final handshakes or hugs. After all they had been through, this parting of ways was the hardest, Ian felt. It was the uncertainty, the terrible uncertainty both parties faced. Colour and light from the portal swam across their faces, distorting their friends' expressions. It was all wrong. Deeply wrong.
"Best of luck,"
said Ian.
and meant it.
"Mind how you go," said 3 of the Andrewses, all together. No one smiled. "Come along," said the doctor, taking Susan by the hand. She linked arms with Griffiths, who linked arms with Barbara. Barbara turned to Ian and held her hand out to him. In her eyes was that look he knew only too well. They were in the thick of it again, with all the odds stacked against them, and yet she felt better for Ian being with her. That was enough for him, for now. He took her hand, held it tight. "Okay, Doctor," he said, suddenly sure it would all work out somehow. Without another word, they walked into the light.